If you could please take your seats. We are just thrilled to have a poet of Grace Schulman's stature here this afternoon, not to mention that it is her birthday today. Happy birthday, Grace. I'm going to give a little introduction, and then I'm going to give her the microphone. Grace studied at Bard. She graduated from American University in 1955, and then from NYU with a PhD in 1971. She's Distinguished Professor of English at Baruch College, taught poetry writing at Princeton, Columbia, Wesleyan, Bennington, and Warren Wilson College. I am abbreviating this. There is miles on her, but to go on. Her collection, Days of Wonder, New and Selected Poems, was selected by Library Journal as one of the best poetry books of 2022, and was also a finalist for the Phi Beta Kappa Award of that year. She received the Frost Medal for Lifetime Achievement by the Poetry Society in 2016, which I think is phenomenal, and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 2019. It's about time, I'd like to say, but nonetheless, congratulations, that's quite an award. She's often been referred to as an ekphrastic poet because she connects with painting and the other arts, and she's championed Marianne Moore, was poetry editor of The Nation, where she published Octavio Paz, W.S. Merwin, and Mae Swenson, among others. And she directed the Poetry Center of the 92nd Street Y. This is not a dull moment in your life. She received the Delmore Schwartz Memorial Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, 5 Pushcart Prizes, New York University's Distinguished Alumni Award, and a fellowship from the New York Council on the Arts. Her poems have appeared in all the great anthologies and have appeared in every notable publication you can name, pretty much. One of the favorite quotes that I read about her was from Wallace Shawn, who wrote, "When I read her, she makes me want to live to be 400 years old, because she makes me feel there is so much more out there, and it's unbearable misery to miss any of it." I just think that's like such a wonderful way of describing the gift of your poetry. There will be cake served afterwards, and we're so happy to have Canio's Books here, helping us sell books for Grace. Thank you so much for being here and for always being a champion of poetry in our community. It really has meant a huge amount, and we're so delighted that you can all join us today. Without further ado, here's Grace Schulman.
Thank you, April. Thank you, April. I just wanted to add that first and foremost, it's William Shakespeare's birthday, and and he would want very much to be here today, because one of the great things he said is that poetry, art generally, the object of art is to give life a shape. And I think that's what the church does so much of the time, in collecting art, in presenting beautiful paintings and beautiful art to the people, giving our lives a shape. And so I want to dedicate this reading to William Shakespeare. I think he would enjoy it, here. Well, I'm glad to see you all here, and I'd like to start by reading a poem that was in the Star, in the current issue of the Star. Which you may have seen, in order to come to the reading. It's called Scallop Shell, and it happened when I found scallop shells on one of our beautiful bays, Louse Point, And I thought of the pilgrims who visited the tomb of St. James on a road called Camino de Santiago. They visited James in a plague year, and they pinned scallop shells to their capes as badges because St. James was found miraculously alive, coming to the surface of the water after he had thought to be drowned, and his body was covered with scallop shells, and that was the origin of the Pilgrim's March. Scallop shell. See them at low tide, scallop shells glittering on a scallop-edged shore, whittled by water into curvy rows, the shape of waves that kiss the sand only to erode it. Today I walked that shoreline humming Camino Santiago, the road to St. James's tomb, where pilgrims traveled, scallop badges on their capes, and chanted prayers for a miracle to cure disease. And so I, stirred by their purpose, hunted for scallop shells shaped like pleated fans, with mouths that open and close to steer them from predators. I scooped up a fan and blew off sand grains, thinking for that one moment of how St. James's body rose from the sea decked with scallops, and of this empty beach in another austere time. Let this unholy pilgrim implore the scallop shell, silvery half moon, save us. I'd like to read a few of the new poems from my new book. It's called Again the Dawn, Selected Poems, 1976 to 2022, and there are new poems in it. And I thought I would start with those. This is a monologue spoken by Sister Jacques Marie, who came to the great painter Matisse as Monique Bourgeois, as his helper, his nurse, his love, perhaps. And she later became a nun. And so the poem is called Confessions of a Nun. I speak as her, and of course I don't look much like a nun, I'm not a nun. But they say that people often make the distinction between poetry and fiction, but poetry is fiction, actually. And the monologue is a way of presenting another character as oneself. Confessions of a Nun. Yes, I loved Matisse. He made it for me, you know, this church of glass and fire. Now, when the sun rolls rectangles on floors through windows painted yellow, I remember the yellow broom we stumbled through each morning when we climbed this hill, and how he stirred to greens and scrub weeds, whites in the anemones, and blues in the sliver of sea beyond rock terraces. He owned his loves, his Vence, I his Monique, nurse, disciple, Rose. But who was I? Harsh words we had, a few. I had to leave for me, myself, my holy vows. If I belonged to anything, It was, how could I tell him, someone larger. Il faut y voir plus. There must be more. Later, he aged arthritic, waiting for the angel to wound him. None appeared. But when my sisters called for a new chapel, I drew a priest he painted on the wall while belted to his chair. I tied a brush to a long twig, strapped it to his arm, and watched him paint anger in daring strokes, an outsized poppy, the Virgin and Child, a monk. Rage for lost years, for few to come. Why does he think his work is never finished? And yet he seemed, what is it? Pitié. Not for him. He told me once in wartime, his daughter captured, tortured for her fight in the Maquis, he wept at home alone, all the while painting joy in reds and violets. Now in this blue-green-yellow chapel, seeing the late-day sunlight on the sketches of plane tree, priestly vestments, and an altar the color of risen bread, I know at last that just as he held my vows in his great hands, he, godless, will work it out with God. The next of the new poems is called Night Visitor. It was inspired by my thinking a lot about flamenco dance and watching it, and duende, which the singers rise to duende, which is a spirit of creativity that has to do with night and an artist's confrontation with mortality. But it's always, Lorca wrote, night sounds, all that has night sounds has duende. Night Visitor. I've had more soothing callers at my window. There's the muse that brushes by as lightly as a dangling scarf. An Arier, the helium balloon from my neighbor's nuptials, tied to her guardrail, wafting my way. Not him. The window demon comes at night and jabs at a guitar. The jangling discords and moonless tones call up ferocious joy. Fingers move crab-like on a fretted neck. He strums the undersides of leaves, roses the color of blood, silence in the sea's roar. Hearing those wails, ears that had been dulled, quicken to danger. The quieter muse blows elegies on a muted trumpet. Swift angels bless the dead and fly away, but he lands often, toe heel, and I tremble. I tremble all the more when he isn't there. I'd like to read now, by some request, I'd like to read Because. Because in a wounded because in a wounded universe, the tufts of grass still glisten. The first daffodil shoots up through ice melt, and a red-tailed hawk perches on a cathedral spire. And because children toss a fire-red ball in the yard, where a schoolhouse facade was scarred by vandals, and joggers still circle a dry reservoir, because a rainbow flaunts its painted ribbons and slips them somewhere underneath the earth, because in a smoky bar, The trombone blares louder than street sirens because those who can no longer speak of pain are singing. And when, on this wide meadow in the park, a full moon still outshines the city lights, and on returning home below the North Star, I see new bricks and glass where the towers fell. And I remember my love's calloused hand soften in my hand while crabapple blossoms showered our lips, and a yellow rose opened with its satellites of orange buds, because I cannot lose the injured world without losing the world. I'll have to praise it. Thank you. Thank you. This next poem is called Hickories. Why do I write of hickories, whose boughs touch other boughs across a slender road? When our neighbor, Hanin, born in Gaza, cried that a missile ripped her niece apart in the family garden, the child's father found her intestines stuck to a cypress bark, and he too perished in the end, in the raid. Her mother wrote to Hanin before the news was out, "Help me, take my hand. Why do I rave of hickories reaching out their crooked fingers?" Because before the fires, the child Lena was dropping almonds into a linen napkin. Soon she would run to offer them for dinner. Like Lena, I race to show you hickories, their nuts shrunken brown globes, soon to fall. And this is image worship. Faces on the lid of the Knabe Grand caught my eye when I read The Happy Farmer, dreaming of plows far from my rutted sidewalks, digging not earth, but notes, and neither happy nor a farmer. I hit wrong keys, taunted by the metronome. As a distraction, I stared at smiles in silver frames, war dead. I never knew them, heavy-fingered, longing for their lightness. I saw an uncle waving, somebody's hellraiser climbing an oak, an aunt, a doctor's silk scarf blown in wind. Suddenly my face appeared among the faces soon to hide or to be interred. The woman's deep-set eyes in the black-white photograph, mine in the framed glass, merged, until the wind, lifting her scarf, blew through me. Now, when I stirred to brighter images, a yellow coat, a fawn sleek arabesque, I think of photographs and of Aeneas, who in a strange city, stunned by a shrine with pictures of his own city's destruction, broken statues, fires, the dead, cried out, "Sunt lacrimae rerum," there are tears in things. And this is my pandemic poem. I saw where I live in New York, Washington Square Park, I saw a completely empty park, no people in it, and I wondered what the world would be like without us in it. Not without the world itself, but without us in the world. Gone. From my window, I see the world without us in it. A vacant park, a silver maple sheltering no reader, a cherry tree dressed like a bride betrayed, her wedding canceled, a dogwood tree whose whites will fall without regretful eyes. No baby strollers, no candy wrappers stuffed in bins, just a sign, no bicycles, and memories of skateboard pirouettes. Around us death, the numbers spin the mind, fever dreams, the last breath held alone. I had not thought death had undone so many. This park reminds us it was once a field for the unclaimed dead of galloping yellow fever. Construction workers dug up skeletons that had lain for years beneath our footsteps. Death in the hanging elm, a rooted gallows. Now the clear air, pollution-free, is poison for walkers, while trees stand stern, immune. Sad paradox. For comfort, I recall Camille Pissarro would have lingered here. He painted Paris gardens from a window, having left his island's sprawling shores. For tighter scenes, he gazed at people. Matchsticks from above, in ones and twos. Below, the park's unlittered paths are mute. But wait. Just now, a mournful, prayerful sax, unseen from somewhere, unlooses notes, calls me to the window, and I hear the sounds I can't imagine days without. I'd like to read a few poems of this wonderful land we live in out here, where I find it so wonderful to work. The Springs. This poem is called The Sound. Accabonock, Shinnecock, Peconic, Napeague, the creek, the bay, the ocean, the stream, the sounds of consonants, hard C's and K's, Atlantic, the ocean's surge, the clicks of waves collapsed on rocks in corrugated waters. The crowd circling a stranded whale sent by the god Moshop to beach at Pomanak. The Montauks left us names, their successors, Millers and Bennetts, whose names are carved on local gravestones, rode rough tides, strung trawl lines for cod, and even on Sundays parked vans by the sea and gazed in fear until commercial hulls replaced their boats. Surfmen gave names to streets that bag the tourists who prize their charm. I hear old sailors rage in many languages against cold winds. The light now clear, now haze, Pharaohs and Mulfords, whalers, names unknown, hurl throaty curses that rise with the sound of waves and with the cries of an ice-colored gull plucking scallops in shadows. Where I live in Springs, there's a wonderful fireplace bay, so called because the settlers used to light fires there to warn the people, to tell the people across the way, really, that they needed rakes or hoes. Please send workers. And before that, the Indians would light fires to warn of pirates. Well, I thought of that when my cell phone didn't work. And I was having trouble with Verizon. And I thought, oh, for a fire signal. Fireplace Bay. Where are the fires that crackled on this hill? The leap, the sparks, the urgency of wood smoke. Fires that singed, that heightened conversations and shadowed sunken jaws. The Montauk people stoked magenta flames that warned of danger. The colonists tossed seaweed over fires for smoke that twisted into bearded clouds, and shouted to the island across the sound, "Food is on its way." Smoke clouds replying, "Sheep's wool newly sheared, ready for transport." And send over clamming rakes from Parsons' smithy. Speak, fires! Last night a cedar fell in a downpour, crashing power lines that need repair. Cell phones fail without towers nearby. Computers sleep in this speechless neighborhood. I dream of fires and of a surfman who recounts his catch in stories that flare up in orange blaze and circle into smoke, like words. And this poem, composed on one of my walks on the ocean, is called Exile, having to do with Ben Webster, a great jazz player. Exile. Walking on sand littered with broken shells, a scallop fan, a whelk, cracked on its journey to shore, I spun around, far out at sea, slow at the start, a keening, no, a murmur, as haze cleared and a man grew into sight. Broad shoulders, puffy eyes, looming above the waves, Ben Webster soloing. Holding his tenor sax like a figurehead, he played in a ghostly breath, a whisper, then a vibrato, and a howl in air. Time after time stopped. Years before, he'd fled to Holland, no work, no money, racial slurs at home. And now, over the sea's hiss and churn, comes the unbroken chord, the tremolo, the weaving five-note phrase. A low blues filled with shadowy days, mist on a horn that glisters in the light. This poem is called Happiness. Happiness is not a campfire, but an occulting light, a field of fireflies that blink on, off, on. The tree you planted, whose apples fall to the ground, half rotten, half sweet. The street's jackhammers that fall quiet at night. The black skimmer's white underside. The life together, apart together. The long marriage, oxymoronic in its dank joy. Under a half moon quivering through sycamores, you held my body half the night as I lay in your arms, sometimes half awake, speculating, well, happy families are unalike. I choose you with your handicap, your half mobility, not to mention your leisure in forsaking all others, for the chance of our wholeness. I take you, my choice as certain, as plankton on sand lights up and arcs to the stars. And this, another love poem called Moon Shell. I have to thank my friend Pat Strawn for finding me a perfect whelk shell on the beach. This poem is about looking for a perfect shell, and I couldn't find it. And Pat found the poem in the Star, and she provided the poem with the shell. I'll never forget that. It's called Moon Shell. August, I walk this shore in search of wholeness, among snapped razor clams and footless quahogs. How easily my palm cradles a moon shell coughed up on shore. I stroke the fragments as last night I stroked your arm, smelling of salt, scrubbed clean by the sea air. Once you loped near me, now in my mind's eye, your rubbery footsoles track sand hills, the shape of waves you no longer straddle. You inch forward, step, comma, pause. Your silences the wordless rage of pain. But still at night our bodies merge in sleep and fit unbroken like the one perfect shell I've never found and can only imagine, and crack when we're apart. I clutch the moon shell, guardian of unknowing, chipped and silent, until I fling it down and feel its loss. Broken, it fit my hand, and I was whole. Well, one more. One more marriage poem, and this is called The Vow. That day, I stepped gingerly with my father, playing father. Actors played their parts, down the blue carpeted aisle to be wed or tried for treason. A skeletal pianist fingered a funeral march, hitting wrong notes. We passed Mom in a dress sizes too large she'd bought to play the mother of the bride. My own tight bodice pinched as I gasped for breath, bound for a new life, knowing the old would do. I glanced upward at friends playing hope, my roses drying brown as I neared an altar set too high and built of rotting pine. My father gave this woman, me, to some imposter who would want me to be faithful as Ruth, which meant, I suppose, to follow my mother-in-law whither she goest. Yes, I wanted this, but want is a moment in a long sentence without punctuation. What if, like some birds I could not sing in captivity, would it be, I pleaded, security or maximum security? Divorce would disappoint my grandmother, crying here for joy in silk chiffon. And then at last I saw him, the one who wasn't playing anyone, his eyes hazel, shining like Aggie's in first light. And I said, yes, of course, I will. This is another monologue called Eve Speaks. After you had named the Leviathan, Ziz for great bird, and called out dissension for when the moon glowered at the sun, creation for beginning, and expulsion for the end, after you gave us willow, thought up oryx, and what you tagged tornado, sent the olive God's tree trembling, and after cymbals, almonds for first love, crocus for lamp glow, you fell silent. Because when you had found labels for sin, archangels, heaven, even, God help you, God. And each new phrase drowned in lion's roar, or was it divine rage? You declared enough, knowing you'd gone too far. Words can't give life or raise the moon. And still I plead, say my name, Eve, say love, say. And this is a poem that took a good deal of nerve to write. It's called God Speaks. In Genesis, we never hear the voice of God directly. We always hear, and God said, let there be light. God said this, God did this. And I wanted to hear God's voice, so I made it up. And here's God's voice. God's voice. God speaks. Before the hour I cried, let there be light. I tossed out some 300 early versions. Revisions help. What clatter in the firmament, though, when mountains fell, stars fizzled out. This work is my best, at least for now. I called, I named each thing, and it was so. I cannot tell you how, from heaven to seas to people, all sprang up wanting to be. The methods I advise are more precise. Noah's Ark, for instance, gopher wood, 3 stories high, side entrance, and a window. Here, when I said, the waters, oceans rose. Worlds are never finished, only abandoned. Yet this one came alive when there were woods for creeping things, dry land for men and women, the evening and the morning, they were good. Creation had been done before, of course, in legend. Same formless waste and darkness. But with one change, the Babylonians have many gods. Always I work alone. And this is Auden wrote that poetry makes nothing happen, and this is a poem I've read hoping for peace in the Middle East. So far, it hasn't had effects. It's a ghazal, an Arabic, a 7th century Arabic form, basically of couplets that rhyme in certain ways. But the odd thing about this ghazal is that it's a Yom Kippur ghazal. I used to come out here during the high holidays break from teaching at Baruch and sit by the bay, not without guilt. but I enjoyed doing that, and this is where the poem takes place. Prayer. For Aga Shahid Ali was a poet who made the ghazal, the true ghazal, known among American poets. He brought it to us and how to write it and so forth. Prayer. Yom Kippur, wearing a bride's dress bought in Jerusalem, I peer through swamp reeds, my thought in Jerusalem. Velvet on grass, odd, but I learned young to keep this day just as I can, if not as I ought, in Jerusalem. Like sleep or love, prayer may surprise the woman who laughs by a stream or the child distraught in Jerusalem. My Arab dress has blue, green, yellow threads, the shades of mosaics hand-wrought in Jerusalem, that both people's prize, like the blue-yellow dome of the rock, like strung beads and clothes said to ward off the drought in Jerusalem. Both savor things that grow wild, coreopsis in April, the rose that buds late like an afterthought in Jerusalem. While car bombs flared, an Arab poet translated Hebrew verses whose flame caught in Jerusalem. And you, Shahid, sail Yuda Halevi's sea as Ion Khalib's course like an Argonaut in Jerusalem. Stone lions pace the Sultan's gate while almonds bloom into images Hebrew and Arabic wrought in Jerusalem. No words, no metaphors, for knives that gore flesh on streets where the people have fought in Jerusalem. As this spider weaves a web in silence, may Hebrew and Arabic be woven taut in Jerusalem. Here at the bay, I see my face in the shadows and plumb for the true self our Abraham sought in Jerusalem. Open the gates to rainbow-colored words of outlanders, their sounds untaught in Jerusalem. My name is Grace, Kana in Hebrew and in Arabic. May its meaning, God's love, at last be taught in Jerusalem. I'd like to read one or two of my jazz poems. Talina, am I all right on time? Jazz poems. Well, this is cool jazz. Late afternoon, under a salmon sky, a night heron, stalking with shark-hole plumage, leans sideways like a bowling pin off balance on an island risen for the day only to sink later with the tide. I saw Miles Davis lean aslant, a night heron on Broadway, shoulders hunched, horn pointed down, until he hoisted brass and played away sadness of Spain, his sadness, with a tight mute and without vibrato, making a sound like moaning underwater, then wider, embracing all sound, turn cries, wind and cedars. In the silence of a heron stabbing minnows, you could hear Miles, his hunger of another kind, deeper, gnawing, harder to feed. Applause rose up like water slapping the shore. He lowered his eyes, muttered, "Endings just drag me," and walked off the platform. The heron flew. Street music, Astor Place. There he is, outside the subway entrance, where sunlit figures race down steps to darkness, their hearing, like mine, dulled by traffic winds. He sits low and drums jazz on a plastic box, turned upside down, white with blue letters stamped by its owner, U.S. Postal Service. Made for mail, though with an alto's range. Now he raises sticks and beats staccato, up-tempo, faster than your foot can tap. Judging from his gaze, the eyes unfocused, no money jug in sight, no pause for offerings, no violin cases open like birds' beaks. I'd say he dives for notes that only he hears and swims up proud. He raps sticks soft and loud, alone, though he may think his rattling joins a trumpeter's phrases blown on breakneck speed or a pianist's feathery arpeggios. For me it does. The sound calls back a cave of smoke, tall laughter, a bass player's solos, a tenor sax eases out notes in a whisper that grows into a regal tone and floats above the chords. Faces gleam at tables, but no, the subway entrance man's alone. He rumbles on, catching the city's breath, rolling out solitude in the midst of clatter. His playing says, if you rub two sticks together, you'll have fire, or you might have music. And one more jazz poem. My first job after college was working for Glamour magazine, and all that changed when I heard Thelonious. After that, I went straight, wrote poems, and went to graduate school. Thelonious himself. They came back new each night, thumps, craggy runs, one-finger jabs at keys that were hot pans, heels dug in wood, soles flapping like seals. He stabbed notes that seemed wrong until they soared, all ragged beauty. Just 25, I envied his starry reach, the risk to play it real. At the Slick magazine, the risk was only no risk. I stabbed a lukewarm keyboard, hard prose about airy tool. Form meant neat, no dissonance. Once I was tapped to herd 10 best-dressed college girls to hear the monk in a cafe on St. Mark's Place. Not bad. Now, there was neatness. Strict as shorebirds grouping, they filed in, bread knife heels clacking in tempo, strangled waists, sleek heads acclaiming finish. 10 S-shapes, 20 legs monk ogled through dark glasses, bamboo frames. He didn't sneer at their clatter, no. While the sax wailed solo, monk stood tall and swayed forward, unmistakably davening, moved by some unseen beauty. Suddenly, he snapped fingers as though to shape pain into order. That was form. And all was void, as before creation. And there was light. I left the job next day. Okay, thank you.
we're now going to open up to questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions for Grace. Great.
Are all those poems in one book, or are they a collection? Are all those poems in one book, or are they a collection from many books?
The ones I read today were mostly from my new book.
Wonderful.
Which is new and selected. Again, the Dawn. New and selected poems. I think they're selling it back there. But I wrote 9 books of poems, and I excerpted poems from those 9 books for the selected, which is very difficult. It's like killing off your children. I mean, you have to select, but I did the best I could.
Thank you. Unlike the length it takes to write a novel, how much time would you spend on one of these pieces from beginning to end?
Sometimes 15 years. Well, I'll start a draft and not go back to it for a long time. And truly, 15 years is what one of those poems I read took to really get into shape. But I do have the novelist's habit of getting up very early in the morning and working every day. And I think that came from my working as a reporter when I was right out of college. But it's been with me all my life.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. And it's so nice to have Phil here, too. We all look up to you guys. I just wanted to say that I paused when you said poetry is fiction. And I'm intrigued by that sentence, because poetry is often confused with journalism because of the word I. People have difficulty, if it's lyric poetry as opposed to narrative poetry, to separate the word I from, well, to keep it in the lyric mode. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
I don't have any thoughts about the lyric mode, but I can tell you that poetry is made up. Even when the narrator is I. And if it isn't made up, it's not a poem, it's a diary entry of some sort. The making up of a poem. And I remember once you asked me, is that really true, or did you make it up? Well, something like that may have happened, but not the fact itself. As a matter of fact, I wrote a memoir a few years back called Strange Paradise, which itself, when you write a memoir, you do have a contract with the reader to tell what happened, to tell the facts. But you can also shape the narrator and let the facts depend upon what the narrator sees at that moment in time. Well, it could be the same with poetry to a more imaginative extent, that the narrator sees things in a certain way, and it could be surreal, it could be any way that this event is seen. But it is fiction, certainly, yeah. Eric.
And I'd like to go back to the 15 years between the start and the finish of a poem. You know, the feeling I get from poems, from your poems, etc., is an inspired moment. And the idea that you could start something, leave it alone for that length of time, come back to it with that same sort of essence of an inspired moment of seeing, knowing, or whatever, fascinates me. So can you talk a little bit about, like, did you leave the poem 15 years before because you didn't think it was going anywhere?
One of the poems I read today, Confessions of a Nun, was inspired by, I had lived in Vence for 3 summers, and went every day to the Matisse Chapel. And the first, well, that was more than 15 years ago, and the first draft I wrote was a first-person visit to that chapel, which was, God, it was inspiring, it was beautiful. And it took me 15 years to, I didn't leave it alone. I wrote maybe 100 drafts of it, until finally it occurred to me, this poem is spoken not by me, but by Matisse's helper and nurse. And that's when I put her into the poem. Yeah.
How do you know when a poem is finally finished?
Well, it's like I wrote in my God Speaks poem, worlds are never finished, only abandoned. I don't think they're ever finished, do you? I think they're never finished. They may be published, but a lot of the poems in my new and selected are revised from earlier books that they appeared in. So that publication doesn't finish them, really. Nothing does. Death, maybe. Sometimes. I hope. Lizzie. Yeah, Catherine.
Oh. So I was thinking about that issue of revision for new and selected poems, and I know that you care so much about Marianne Moore, and both she and Auden did some major revisions of their work and their selected poems. So to follow up on Phil's point, is there a tense moment when you're putting those poems together and think maybe it's best to leave them alone and not to revisit something that's, because they did, I think the two of them did a little bit of damage to their work.
Yeah, and I think it's possible to learn from the damage they did. For example, the famous example that Marianne Moore, her famous poem Poetry is reduced to 3 lines. And in my edition, I put the original version in the text and the 3 lines in the notes, reversing it from her original intention. Well, I hope I've learned from that. And there is a point at which you say to yourself, what am I doing here? But there's still something. It may be, you may be going back to some of the old version, but it's still like a dialectic. It still moves ahead because it's not the same as it was. You've learned something from the revision process, yeah.
Hi, Grace.
On your interest in jazz. Comment on my interest in jazz. I've always loved it. I must have played Miles Davis kind of blue and green 1,000 times. But oddly enough, I find jazz rhythms out here in the landscape, in the ocean, in the bay. I wrote a poem called Blue and Green while copying a book that my dear editor, friend Pat Strawn edited, and she used to write 1M dashes, so I saw the bay as 1M dashes, and Miles's music coming from the bay. I can't explain it, it's difficult, but I love jazz. Infiltrate.
No, I don't. Hi, Jazz. Hi, Jazz. Grace, I know that it's Shakespeare's birthday, but I was wondering who your greatest influence you would call on your poetry today.
Hopkins. He's my main man. Yeah. Hopkins. I love his urgency, his passion, and strong verbs. Sometimes made up, wonderful, yeah.
Hello. Do you have a particular philosophy that you're trying to get to, and do you find yourself coming back to that philosophy in everything that you write?
Probably so, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but probably several things. One of them is that nothing is ever completed. I find that coming up, I don't do it purposely, but I find it coming up in a lot of the poems I write, especially now, that we live in a state of fragmentation, and that while we're alive, there's disruption in almost everything we do. I once saw a log on one of our beaches here that reminded me that I saw as a body, and but without arms, without legs, and I thought of the statues without arms and legs, and I thought of how so much art stands for itself without completion. Well, that's one thing that keeps coming back, and a lot of others do too, yes.
Do you want to talk about those others?
I can't think of them offhand, and it would take a lot of... Let's get together and have coffee, and it will all come back, yeah.
Thank you.
Grace said today is Shakespeare's birthday, the Bard, and I noticed that Google has created Bard, a chatbot, which can write pretty damn good poems, and should we all just quit?
Would you publish any of those in the pushcart press?
You wouldn't know, because Bard is very crafty.
I doubt it very much. I doubt it. I haven't looked into it, Bill, but I don't think I will.
Do you look for your poems, or do they come and find you?
Always they find me. In fact, I have 1/3 of a new book since the book. I didn't mean to write it. I thought I'd be writing another prose memoir, but the poems came, and yes, they write me. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Grace. If anyone would like to purchase a copy of her book, Canio's is selling them in the back, and we also have cake over there. So happy birthday, and thank you so much for being here.